do apologize. My computer wasn't being user-friendly. So, welcome everyone.
Group is the technical or is the threat intelligence arm of the company. So today what we're going to start with is a little bit of background on Egregor, so talk a little bit about who they are, what they've done, some of their victims, and then we're going to move into a technical deep dive on the ransomware itself. Then we're going to talk a little bit about overlaps with other threat actors and ways to track Egregor is what we will finish up with. So to give you a bit of an idea of who Egregor is, they began operating in September of 2020, and the ransomware itself is considered a variant of the Sekhmet ransomware family. So around the same time, Maze, which is another ransomware family that I'm sure you're all familiar with, stopped encrypting new victims. So in September 2020 as well. So really what we observed was, Maze wound down and Egregor started winding up. So it's suspected that many of the affiliates of the Maze ransomware variant have moved over to Egregor. So once Maze went down, they moved to Egregor. And like many big game ransomware threat groups, they do the name and shame of their victims, and their extortion site is called Egregor News. So you can see on the right an example of one of these extorted companies on the Egregor News site. So where they threaten to release the data if the company does not pay. So in mid-February, actually, members of the Egregor Ransomware-as-a-Service were arrested in the Ukraine. And at the time, so since about middle of February, so 2/12/21-ish, we started to see that their infrastructure, so their C2s, their leak site, have been down since then. I'm just checking the comments. Can people hear me? Great, fantastic. But appetite and desire to conduct ransomware attacks. So if they are successful and they actually succeed in getting a ransom from a company, the ransomware developer who created the code gets some cut of this ransom. So some ransomware affiliate programs are anybody can join if they pay in, and then others are more selective, so they have to be invite only. You have to be chosen to participate. So because Egregor uses a ransomware-as-a-service model, as we'll discuss shortly, the TTPs will vary between the attacks. So this could be anything from those initial access techniques. So how does the threat actor introduce kind of malicious code to the organization's systems? And we'll talk about those. To also sort of the things that they use for the pre-encryption techniques, such as lateral movements. So once they're inside the network, they want to sort of figure out where else they want to move within it. Ultimately, they're really trying to create the maximum impact from their attack. So trying to figure out, what different parts of the network are there, what shares, what other pieces should they be on in order to encrypt as much as possible when they drop the ransomware. They'll perform reconnaissance. So what kinds of information do they want to collect about the system itself? Because ultimately they may want to drop other tools. So what kinds of things are on the network that they also might want to target that maybe the ransomware wouldn't necessarily target itself? And then doing credential stealing. So in either to enable access to other parts of the system, or if they want to, save some credentials for future access just in case they're not changed, they might do this as well. So as I alluded to, this could also be tools used in really any stage of this ransomware attack. So like I said, after performing some initial reconnaissance, the threat actor might want to drop additional tools that might have additional capabilities. So you might see something like banking bots or other kinds of credential acquisition malware. So things like Mimikatz, other pieces of other tools that might help them further accomplish their goals. But this will really depend on the affiliate, their goals, and then the organizational system that they're in. So some affiliates may be or have been involved with other ransomware groups. So the idea is, if an affiliate is only working with one Ransomware-as-a-Service group versus two, you may start to see some of the TTPs start blending together, and we'll talk about this more. So as people participate in different programs and move between programs, you start to see some kind of blurring of the TTPs that are associated with a particular group in general. So Egregor was especially prolific while it was active. So by the end of 2020, they had claimed 206 victims according to their extortion site. And these were definitely large, well-known organizations that I'm sure we're all familiar with if you look at the names of targeted groups. And how this fits into the ransomware attack landscape as a whole. So looking at this chart, so through November 2020, here's about the approximate breakdown of a lot of the big ransomware groups and how many attacks they accomplished through November. And you can see that Maze, that ransomware group we mentioned originally, was responsible for almost 26% of the attacks. So they were active for the better part of this time period, so at least through the better part of September. But then if you look at Egregor, which as we discussed, started off only in September, they're responsible for about 13%. So in the span of, at this point, about 2 months, Egregor really hit the ground running with encrypting as many victims as they could. And then in that short time period of about 3 months, they had already successfully encrypted 206 victims. So I want to underscore that these are only the ones that were successful and that they published and we know about. It's very likely that there were many other attacks that actually didn't work out. So this only represents a portion of these attacks. So in order to understand how an Egregor ransomware attack unfolds, I've divided the attack into kind of 4 main stages. So the initial access, so again, how does the threat actor introduce the malware or first stage of the malware malicious tools to the organization's network? And then moving into lateral movement and reconnaissance. So now that they're on the system, what are they doing to enable themselves to move around through it, to collect different information and data about the group? So the time that's spent here is known as dwell time. So this can range anywhere from a couple of hours between the initial access and the dropping of the ransomware up to days or weeks. So it really does vary based on the threat actor who's doing the attack, their specific needs, desires, and really what they're trying to accomplish. So I wasn't able to find any data about the average kind of Egregor ransomware dwell time, but I would argue that that's maybe not super useful because it's probably very affiliate dependent, and maybe some affiliates kind of have their own pattern of behavior or ways of attacking systems. So next we're moving on to the exfiltration of the data. So as you can imagine, you can't really extort a company unless you have something to extort them with. So at this stage is where the threat actor takes some or a bunch of the organization's data and then takes it off the system. And then that is what they would threaten to release on that extortion site. So this is arguably the stage where it's very hard for organizations to kind of mitigate against the threat of extortion itself. You may see things like phishing or anti-phishing, other kind of like detections for lateral movement and reconnaissance. But really this data exfiltration, I would argue, is one of the scariest things for a corporation. And this is kind of that final stage before you get to the dropping of the ransomware. So this is the stage that we're all probably pretty familiar with in association with ransomware. So this is where the ransomware lands on the individual system and encrypts everything. So what this looks like from the Egregor perspective. So let's start with initial access. So nothing here really stands out as very Egregor specific. So phishing, I'm sure you're all familiar with phishing, is used by pretty much any threat actor because it works, it's simple, changing the lures around, really to try and get a victim to click on something and download that initial stage of malware. Then we have RDP exploits and VPN exploits. So these are fairly commonly used among different kinds of big game hunting ransomware threat actors. Really, again, nothing very Egregor specific here. Moving on to lateral movement and reconnaissance. So I'm sure many of you are very familiar with at least some of the products on this list. So Cobalt Strike is a open commodity tool, openly available commodity tool that is used by threat actors who are APTs or threat actors who are, criminal threat actors. It's a pen testing type tool that's available for purchase on the internet. Really not distinctive of any particular threat actor in general, but very commonly used. Then you have some of your more kind of common banking Trojan and bots. So QuakeBot, Ursnif, and IceID. Again, not very Egregor specific and popular among several types of threat actors as a precursor to kind of the final stages of their malware that they drop. And then AdFind and Advanced IP Scanner. So again, nothing really highly Egregor specific here. Then it's that exfiltration of data. So I'm sure you're all familiar with 7-Zip at least, and probably rclone for their benign use cases. This is the point where the threat actor will zip up the data and exfiltrate it. So this is particularly interesting because these are both fairly benign, very easily available tools, arguably accomplishing one of the most complex threats for corporations to detect against. And how do you start really looking at, is the presence of 7-Zip on my system good or bad? Finally, we get to the dropping of the actual malware itself. So here is kind of the first extremely Egregor specific stage that we have, which, as you kind of notice, is at the point where it's almost too late to prevent this ransomware attack because we have now introduced the ransomware to the system. Another particularly interesting thing that Egregor did was, in at least one of the cases, they actually print bombed their ransom note to a bunch of the printers at the organization. So you can see in this picture an image of the ransom note being printed out on the company's receipt printer. So I thought that that was fairly interesting for them to have done. So moving into the Egregor ransomware payload itself, there's really 3 layers to this malware payload. So the first, the stage 1 packer, which I saw obfuscated and unobfuscated versions, a stage 2 packer, and then finally the actual Egregor payload itself. So in order to successfully execute this payload, you need to provide at runtime the correct cryptographic key. If you do not provide the correct key, it does not execute successfully. And the payload itself will accept several different kind of command line arguments to determine its functionality and behavior, which we'll talk about shortly. So starting with the stage 1 packer, as I mentioned, I saw 2 different versions, an obfuscated one and an unobfuscated one. So in the image on the right, you can see an example of the unobfuscated first stage packer, mostly just because it was much easier to sort of see what's going on than in the obfuscated one. And because their functionality was semantically identical, it suggests that this is something that was probably a compile time obfuscation utility and not 2 separate pieces of code that were written, at coding time. It's not like they were obfuscating their code. So it's probably something that at compile time or any sort of post-processing created the obfuscation. So let's talk a little bit about how this works. So this first stage packer contains some baked in cryptographic key material to perform the cha-cha cipher decryption. And what's notable about this is that if you have all the key material required to do the decryption, you are totally fine and you can decrypt that next stage. So really this first stage packer functions to, like many packers, obfuscate that next stage. So you can see in the key expand and key nonce add the provision of both the crypto key and the initialization vector. Next, I saw very similar. So all of these first stage packers were very similar and had only very slight differences. So some of them were in the command line parameter that's passed. So you can see here -- no operation. I would see that vary between the samples, doesn't really have much effect on the overall functionality of this first stage packer. In the base64 decode and XOR function, the XOR value varied. Predominantly it was 3 or 4. that I would see in these first stage packers. And then finally, the crypto key and initialization vector. So again, not really impactful because you have all the required key material, so you can be off to the races with your next stage of the packer. So some other interesting things about these packers is that some of them had baked in PDB paths that were fairly similar to each other. So often this will be some sort of compile time or development artifact. So prefaced with m/ewdk and m/sc/p was the majority of what I saw in the samples that I had. So in this table, you can see the distribution of the count of these PDB paths. This could suggest that there are multiple individuals compiling the code, and some were more active than others in doing so. But this could also just be the set of samples that I happen to have. However, it's definitely worth noting that PDB is very easy to modify per build. These patterns are still interesting, but it's notable that in case you're not super familiar with kind of ransomware PDBs in general, sometimes threat actors like Maze will use them to make snarky comments against researchers or kind of put other unrelated information in them. So that is something that threat actors will change. So again, I thought this was interesting to talk about, but obviously not some sort of smoking gun. So moving into the stage 2 packer, so that next stage, here's where things get really interesting. So how this works is that first, there's a function that will read the command line looking for an argument after -p. So this is where that password that I talked about that's required to decrypt the final payload will be passed. This password is then used in a rabbit crypto cipher decryption function. So in case you're not familiar with rabbit ciphers, you're not alone. So this is not something that I've seen really in any other ransomware that I've looked at. So it's very uncommon. Generally, I see things like RC4, DES, triple DES, AES, a lot of those more common cryptographic algorithms. So this stuck out to me as kind of strange. After the decryption takes place, there's a function that will look to see if there's a valid MZ header. So did we successfully decrypt that next payload as a valid PE file? And if we did, we run. So here is really where if you do not pass the correct argument to the ransomware, the correct password, decryption will fail, and then you will not have a valid PE file and you will not run. So game over if you do not have the correct password at this point, and no ransomware attack takes place and you bug out. So if you do pass the correct payload or correct password, you get the Egregor payload itself. So overall, at a high level, it was pretty typical ransomware. It did pretty typical ransomware type things. So first, it did language checks for Commonwealth of Independent States countries. So it looked to see if the computer's language was that of one of those countries. And if it found it, it would bug out. Deleting the shadow copies using WMI is also fairly common. So this just makes it harder for the organization to recover from the attack. So this is fairly common. They do it as well. Stopping processes and services that could aid in recovery and backup. So again, trying to make it harder to recover from the ransomware attack and stop anything that might, stop the ransomware attack from happening. And then finally, it is ransomware. So it encrypts the files on the system. So it avoids specific file extensions and folders predominantly related to the functioning of the actual computer. So you can imagine how encrypting things like executables and DLLs would make your computer stop running because that's kind of what it's built on and what it does. So in that case, if somebody did pay the ransom, it would be very hard to decrypt their system if their computer wasn't working. So by avoiding those files, it makes it more plausible that if they pay the ransom, it will decrypt successfully. And here on the right is an example of an Egregor ransom note, pretty typical ransom note stuff, and gives the victim information about how to pay the ransom. So a little bit more about the Egregor payload. So I mentioned it was very related to the SecMet ransomware family, and it really borrows heavily from that code. So in the processes that are terminated, in particular, like we talked about, that make recovery harder, the extensions and file names to avoid encrypting. So again, related to the functioning of the computer, the ransom note names. So they were both named recoverfiles.txt. The way it renames encrypted files. So after it encrypts the file, it changes the file extension to something to let the victim know something is wrong. The method of string encryption, like I said, I enjoy talking about strange encryption. So both of these ransomware families used this same string encryption algorithm to obfuscate these strings. So it's a fairly simplistic XOR-based cipher, which is common for other ransomware families to use varying XOR ciphers themselves. But this particular one I hadn't seen before, except in Sekhmet and Egregor. So you can get an idea from the pseudocode here in the image on the bottom of what it does. But yep, same between the both. And the method of code obfuscation that we used. So the Egregor payload itself did employ code obfuscation primarily to make the control flow very confusing. So the path that the code takes as it executes, so jumping around a bunch, and you can see some examples of what this looked like in the two images on top. Some of the jump 0 and jump not 0 to the same address, different things like that. Not wildly uncommon when people do employ control flow obfuscation, but this is the technique. So remember this for later as we talk about what some other ransomware families do. And then finally, they had a very similar first stage packer. So remember the one that we talked about that uses the cha-cha encryption with the baked-in key material? Those are very similar between both families. So there were a few key differences that I observed between the Egregor code and the Sekhmet code. So Egregor does have code for an HTTP post request, a network request, but it doesn't appear to be triggered at any point. So this code was functional in the Sekhmet ransomware family, but not in Egregor, suggesting that, you know, if the threat actors just kind of left it in there or was vestigial in some way. So there, but no longer used. Additionally, the Sekhmet code had 2 stages only, and there was no password required to successfully execute the payload. So we talked about that initial first stage packer, and then it would have the Sekhmet payload, but that middle kind of rapid decryption where it checks the it takes the password and tries to decrypt the final payload was not there. So no password required, successfully execute Sekhmet on any double click. And then Egregor does add a couple different command line parameters. So we talked about the command line parameters that change the functionality of the ultimate payload to some degree. So -- samba, which meant that link files will not have the delete on close attribute, and kill RDP, which is self-explanatory, kills off programs that would perform RDP, programs or services that would do RDP. And then finally, in the dropped file names, so Egregor dropped something called dtb.dat, while Sekhmet dropped sysconfig.db. So I've heard a lot of people talk about how similar Egregor and Maze were, and then I just want to highlight a couple of the differences that I noticed in looking at both of these pieces of ransomware. So first, they use substantially different obfuscation techniques than each other. So on the right, in the top image, you can see Maze uses import hashing techniques. So in case you're not familiar with that, import hashing makes it harder for a reverse engineer or an analyst to be able to tell what functionality is being imported into the binary and what's called when. So it's a little bit harder to see, like, well, what this thing might be doing. Egregor doesn't use any sort of import hashing, and it just kind of calls functions and they make sense. While Egregor does use string encryption, Maze does not appear to. So these are kind of like 2 key differences in at least the obfuscation techniques and anti-reverse engineering strategies applied by these 2 pieces of ransomware. In addition, the packers and first stages are very different from each other. So we talked about the one that I observed and used with Egregor, but there was a wide variety of these packers and first stages used with Maze. This is probably an artifact of the affiliate program. So affiliates may be bringing their own first stage packers and just receive that actual ransomware. So it could be things that they rate themselves, or they purchase, or they acquire in some way. You'll see things that are less common. You'll see things that are definitely commodity or kind of like openly available type tools. But it really did vary with Maze, whereas Egregor's first stage was more consistent. In addition, we talked a little bit about the Egregor code obfuscation. So Maze used very different code obfuscation techniques. So you can see in the image, the 2 images on the right, on the bottom, those are just examples of what the obfuscated Maze source code looked like versus what we were talking a little bit about with Egregor. So other researchers have done these great in-depth kind of write-ups of what these obfuscation techniques are and how you take them apart. That are definitely worth checking out if you're interested. However, there was a pretty similar looking kind of country check. We talked about that CIS country language check. So on the bottom left, you can see Egregor and Maze This is not really a smoking gun, in my opinion, and is not definitive proof that they are exactly the same code. But it is really important to mention for our discussion as we talk about similarities and differences at a technical level. So yes, Lindsay, that is just code. What else? So I agree, the diamond model definitely still does hold here. So we can't just consider the relationships from just the technical level, and we'll talk about why. So you really do have to consider infrastructure, actors, and then the victims in really fully understanding similarities and differences between threat actors. So the reason why we can't just look at the technical things is that ransomware affiliates are moving to new variants. They're moving between families, operations are spinning up and down, cartels are forming, commodity tools like we discussed get used. So it starts to be that the hallmarks, like the obvious hallmarks of a specific threat actor or variant starts to become blurred. So let's look at a couple examples. So in Chainalysis' analysis of the blockchain stuff that was associated with ransomware, they saw that there was something that suggested affiliate overlap and other possible connections between a couple of big ransomware families, notably Maze, Egregor, Suncrypt, and Doppelganger. Okay, so then Cobalt Strike, which was that tool we talked about previously, has been used in 70% of big game hunting incidents in 2020. So if you remember, we looked at that graph of ransomware attacks in 2020, there were so many different families on that. So if you start to think that approximately 70% of those attacks were using Cobalt Strike, you start to see that there is probably some overlap between who's using it. And then RDP is the most common attack vector employed to install ransomware, and VPN vulnerabilities are not far behind. And if you remember, those are two of the things that the Egregor ransomware family used. And so a lot of other big game hunting ransomware families are using them too. And then finally, as we've talked about, everyone uses phishing. They will use different lures, different strategies, kind of different initial stage documents, but just mere use of phishing itself is not enough to say it is a specific type of malware or ransomware. So really a lot from the technical level that we're looking at here is just suggestive of the idea of people who do big game hunting at that broad technical level, not a specific threat actor in general. So for defenders, there is some good news here, because many of these same TTPs are used between ransomware actors. So that allows you to focus some of your detections and mitigations on these common issues and tools. So if we see a lot of different kinds of groups using things like Cobalt Strike or certain kinds of RDP or VPN vulnerabilities, focusing our detection and mitigation efforts on those helps us get a little bit more bang for our buck there. And then it helps us be aware of vulnerable products and tools at that high level that if many threat groups are targeting them, maybe we should prioritize these for patching. So for example, in FBI's advisory on the Egregor ransomware, they suggested patching several RDP vulnerabilities from 2019 and 2020. So while these vulnerabilities were associated with specific Egregor attacks now, there's no reason that they won't necessarily be used by other threat actors, especially if they continue to work and other threat actors say, oh, these are very successful, let me try that too. However, there's also some bad news. They're using these TTPs because they're still succeeding at using them. So phishing is going to be an eternal problem. The alerts are more creative now and they change very often. And it's something that as they get very targeted and then people are very enticed by them, people will still keep clicking on stuff. So that's not going away. And patching does take resources. So resource constraints make it hard to patch everything that needs to be patched. And patching may fall by the wayside as other more urgent issues arise for teams, and you have to make difficult decisions about what to prioritize. And then separating the good versus bad use of tools is not easy. So like we talked a little bit about that 7-zip being used for egressing organizations' data, starting to understand whether it's malicious use of 7-zip or benign use is something that is very complicated, especially with the size of many organizations these days and the diversity of tools that folks have on their systems. However, the worst news of all is that while these are the TTPs we know and understand now, these groups will evolve their TTPs if these stop working, or they need to. There is big money in big game hunting. It is a business, and while people are making money, they will still want to do it. And in order to do so, they will try and find different ways of succeeding at it. So we also talked a little bit about the affiliates. And as I mentioned, affiliates move between programs. So maybe they pick up skills in one or find certain success techniques and then move to a new one. And then now they're sitting there and using a lot of these techniques in association with a new group. So while we may have a very good understanding of like what the TTPs associated with Egregor now from an initial access perspective, let's say, look like today, maybe tomorrow they will be different. So really keeping kind of abreast of what are these changing TTPs and what should we be monitoring for over time is really important as things change and evolve and people pick up new skills and new vulnerabilities are announced. So if you're interested in tracking Egregor, there's kind of a couple approaches you can take. So first, looking at it from the more general level. So monitoring for unexpected commodity and openly available tools. So things like Cobalt Strike and QuakeBot that Egregor used. This isn't Egregor specific, but these tools are commonly used with other ransomware deployments. So if you're just interested in ransomware in general, that might be something to look for. And in general, unexpected presence of QuakeBot and Cobalt Strike on an organization's system is often a precursor to many different kinds of unsavory behavior, not just ransomware. So if you're looking to mitigate for and defend against things that are more general, bad behavior, that might be something worth doing. And Recorded Future has actually created Sigma rules and YARA rules for some of these to make monitoring and defending easier. If you want to specifically track Egregor itself, there were a couple unique technical aspects that I highlighted. So first, that second stage with the Rabbit crypto is extremely consistent between the samples, even at the byte level. So being able to detect that might help you, find ransomware samples that are associated with Egregor. The string encryption technique that was used in the final payload, so both in Egregor and SecMet, was also very unique. And then finally, that first stage decryption process. So the base64 and XOR, the Cha-Cha cipher, MZPE check, and sleep if fail was a fairly unique pattern that was very consistent among the Egregor samples. So what's next? Everybody wants to know what's next. So now that the affiliates are arrested that are associated with Egregor itself is very likely dead. So it's pretty likely that these operators will move to a new operation, so they're not done. And it's possible that we'll start seeing some of the TTPs that they've used. So not only those other tools that they're using, those commodity tools, but potentially some of the lessons learned and the more, effective aspects of the code might carry to a new operation itself. But it's key to remember that ransomware as a threat is not going to go away anytime soon. And while big game hunting remains big business, it will continue. If people are going to keep making money, they will keep pursuing it as long as organizations are paying. And the idea of that name and shame extortion, if it remains effective in getting organizations to pay, it will likely remain popular. Similarly, the formation of cartels in which groups share things like leak sites and other infrastructure will probably remain fairly popular as well, as long as there is a financial benefit to doing so. So thank you, everybody, for attending. My name is Lindsay Kaye. Does anybody have any questions? I'll look in the question chat. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a nice rest of your day.